So I've been watching some of the Atheist Experience with Matt Dillahunty and numerous other co-hosts as well. Um, for those of you who are not familiar, the Atheist Experience is a television show, I think from Texas, which is hosted by regularly Matt Dillahunty with a various range of co-hosts with different sort of regularity, and they do a call-in show where they talk about religion, God, metaphysics to some degree. Primarily, they talk about Christianity. This is not surprising. The Atheist Experience is located in Texas, in the United States, which is a predominantly Christian country, obviously. And Matt himself, I believe, was a former Christian. I think even a former pastor, or perhaps even a pastor in training, perhaps, or if he wasn't a complete pastor. But he has extensive knowledge of the Bible and Christianity, so that's something that he talks a lot on. So the atheist experience in Matt Dillahunty is quite popular in the atheist secular circles. Matt Dillahunty is one of the probably best known atheists out there, along with your Sam Harris, your Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, those types of people. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit today is a criticism that I have from Matt, but really I've heard many people make this type of argument before. Now I'll preface this by saying that I really do appreciate Matt's work, and I think that his show is valuable in the sense that he really makes people think about things in ways that they hadn't before. You really get that sense when you're listening to the calls that he's giving people who are calling in a different window, a different lens to examine their beliefs, and I think that's a really valuable thing. And I'm really appreciative of Matt for doing that. The show is very interesting in that sense, and one of the ways that Matt does this is he will point out logical fallacies that some of the callers are making. So, for those of you who are not familiar, a logical fallacy is essentially an argument which is structured in such a way that we can't be sure of the conclusion, based on the premises. So there's a number of different logical fallacies, but the one I'm going to be talking about today is one that I have to accuse Matt of doing, unfortunately. So it's one that I call the argument from arrogance. And this is a little bit of a play on words on the argument from ignorance, which Matt is a big fan of, and for good reason. I've heard him bring this one up on many a time as well. And with, as I said, with good reason, because a lot of his guests do employ the argument from ignorance fallacy. So just briefly, the argument from ignorance is essentially making the argument that, well, I don't know what the answer is, or I have no other explanation for what the answer is, so therefore the answer must be God, essentially. So for example, well, we don't know what created the universe, so therefore God must create the universe. This is a little bit like the God of the gaps is kind of the colloquial term that we use to sort of talk about this argument. And as most people realize these days, a God of the gaps is really no God at all. As I said in my last video, our scientific understanding of the world has really accelerated to such a degree that a God of the gaps is it's really no God at all. I mean, so many things that were explained by this so-called God of the gaps are now just understood in purely physical terms through scientific understanding. That, if this is your definition of God, then you pretty much have to cede the fact that this is just an ever decreasing margin, and eventually, even at least theoretically, we could understand the whole universe in physical terms, and the God would have no space in it anymore. And also the fact that it's completely arbitrary. So to say that, oh well, we used to have God explain the weather and rainbows and floods and whatever, but now we don't because we understand these things aren't God. Well, that's it doesn't really make much sense. Like, was it ever God? Well, obviously not, because we have no reason to think that these sort of physical processes just popped up when we discovered them. In fact, we have a lot of evidence to suggest the complete opposite, that these physical processes have always been at play. So the fact that it's an arbitrary definition of God and it shifts over time and it's receding, it's as I said, it's the God of the gaps is really no God at all, and the argument from ignorance is really a very poor argument for the existence of God or the metaphysical or the supernatural, for instance. But nevertheless, it's very easy to make the argument from ignorance. In many cases, we have to do it. To be honest, in our daily lives, there's really, like really just to get through the day, and sometimes we have to make assumptions that, well, I'm not totally sure about this, but I've got to make a decision because I've got to go with A or B, and I'll go with, I don't really know what the answer is, but I'll go with this. So it's a kind of reasoning, it's a kind of rationale that we have all employed at times. I mean, just think about, taking a multiple choice test. Well, I don't know what the answer is, but there's got to be a answer, and it's got to be one of these. So A, B, C, D. Let's pick one. That's kind of an everyday argument from ignorance, I guess you could say. So it's something that our brains are familiar with. It's a thought pattern that our brains are familiar with, and I think that's why it's easy to fall into. However, when it comes to the big questions, like the origin of the universe, metaphysics, God, it definitely does not serve us well. So the argument from Arrogance is a little bit of a play on this. The argument from Arrogance is, as I said, I'm picking on Matt Dillahunty a little bit here, but I've heard lots of people make this type of argument. And so an example of the argument from Arrogance would be something like this. So, okay, we now know that our universe is basically infinite in scope. There's trillions upon trillions of galaxies and stars and planets, just an absolute vast space in between all of these things as well. Just an absolutely enormous universe. And people might make the argument, well, if the purpose of God was to create humans, and God is in any way invested in what we do and how we live our lives, and if any of the purpose of the universe is to do with human existence, then it doesn't really make much sense for God to create this enormous universe, which is completely uninhabitable. The vast majority of it is completely uninhabitable to human beings. What is the purpose of that? If you just wanted to create a universe for humans, if you wanted to create this type of reality, then why go to the effort, or why at all? Like, it seems so redundant to create, all this other universe. Now, this is kind of an attractive argument. It's like, well, yeah, it sort of does seem a bit weird, but I actually think that, this only seems weird from our limited human perspective. So we really are finite creatures, and we I would even argue that, we have more in common with a rat than we would have in common with, say, a creator of the universe. But if you think about how similar we are, we're both mammals, we're both warm-blooded, similar reproduction, probably share like 90% of our genetics or something with a rat. We both exist on Earth. We both have finite lifespans. We both need to consume food, drink water, have, sexual reproduction. There's so many ways that we're similar, yet there's absolutely no way that a rat could accurately conceive of human experience and expect to be able to rationalize human behavior. So, I think that it's incredibly arrogant to think that we can rationalize or even expect to empathize with the behavior or thought process of something which created the universe. I just think that's, as I said, very arrogant to think that in our limited human capacity, we actually have the ability to do that with any degree of accuracy at all. I just think that's, yeah, it's incredibly arrogant to think that. And this is, as I said, he talks a lot about Christianity as well in specific. And so that was, more of a general argument for God. But I've heard him talk about it, obviously, specifically in terms of Christianity a lot as well. And, he'll talk about, oh, okay, so in the Christian faith, there's this argument, it doesn't make any sense. So, God, he creates these things, he creates people, but then they sin, and then he has to wipe them out, and then he's got to, he sends his son to like give them a loophole to get out of the sin, which like, he created them, so he created them sinful, and blah blah blah. And it just seems like it's so illogical. Why would a God behave in this way? And yeah, I think you can just make the same argument. It's we don't know how a God would behave. We really don't know. And I think to I think just about all we can say on it is, if there is a God, then if there is a God that created the universe, then he did create it this way, and therefore there must be a reason. And if there's not a God, well, then there's no reason. It's just a mechanistic universe. Okay. But from our perspective, each of those arguments, they don't really explain anything. There's no explanatory power in either of those positions. In my opinion, neither of these positions address the question of if there is a God or not. And I think trying to make an argument like this, and as to whether there is a God or not, is really quite arrogant. And so that's what I call the argument from Arrogance. And I think you'll find a lot of atheist commentators, such as Matt Dillahunty, but many others, fall into this trap quite frequently. So, please let me know in the comments below if you agree with my take on the argument from Arrogance. If you've noticed anyone else doing this, now that you've had it pointed out, you might realize a lot of people actually make this argument against God. But I don't really think it is a good argument for whether there is or isn't a God. So thank you for listening.